I said it this morning, I'll say it again. There's no better place for worship than in the middle of talking about leadership and business, is there? It's where it belongs. You all can have a seat. We're here for our final plenary session. And it gives me really great pleasure to be able to introduce our final speaker. You may notice that his last name and my last name are the same. Let me introduce what he does, and then I'll talk just a little bit about who he is. He is Senior Advisor to the President for University Missions and Faculty Dean of Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. That's a mouthful, but here's what he does. He trains pastors to go into the workplace and to minister as pastors to people who desperately need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. He has come to teach us in this final session about a theology of faith and work, and I will tell you, he and I have had numerous conversations about this over the last 4 or 5 years, and the theology he's going to bring today is life-changing. It is absolutely transforming, and it is the proof positive that a good theology can transform the way you think, which then transforms the way you act. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Scott Ray.
You will notice a slight resemblance, too. Well, good afternoon. It's good to see all of you. Has it been a fruitful day? Good. I'm glad. I've seen the schedule and sat in on the outskirts of a couple of sessions. It looks like it's been a very productive day. So my kudos to all of the folks who put this on, particularly for connecting the idea of leadership with the notion of faith and work. This intersection is really important to us. And so I'm delighted to get a chance to wrap up our time to help us think a little bit about the theological framework for how we connect the dots on faith and what we do in the workplace. I spend a lot of time, I teach in our business school, so I'm around the next generation of young men and women who are going to go out into the marketplace. I want to tell you, you have good reason to be encouraged about the next generation of folks who are coming into the marketplace, because not only do they have a lot of skill in their craft and what they're being trained for, but they have character, they have integrity, and they model that really well. I'm very encouraged about what I see in the next generation of young men and women who are entering the workforce and who are coming into the marketplace. I'll spend a lot of my time around the next generation of pastors, as Mark suggested. I spent a lot of time with my seminary students, encouraging them to serve the men and women who they serve in their local churches in a way to where they change what they're doing. What I've discovered is that my students in the churches in which they serve, they spend a lot of their time addressing a very small minority of what the men and women they serve do in their lives. They spend the majority of their time working on a minority of what their people are doing. I want to encourage them to spend the majority of their time serving their folks to equip them to do what they do with the vast majority of their waking hours, which is what is going on in the workplace. So we call this whole life discipleship. And it's not just for a part of what they do, a segment of life, but it's for what they spend and what you all spend the vast majority of your waking hours doing. So my interest in this came from the experience of my dad. My dad was, I think it's probably fair to say, a consummate business person. He was one of those sort of larger-than-life personalities, but he wasn't obnoxious about it. He was just one of those people who you loved to be around and had an easy time following. He was one of those who could sell just about anything to anybody at any time. You've been around those people? He and my mom came to faith a little bit later in life after my siblings and I had come to faith as teenagers. And they were involved in a terrific Bible teaching church here in Houston for many years. And I remember having discussions with my dad about how he understood the relationship between his Christian faith and what he did with the majority of his life, Monday through Friday. And after all we talked, the best he was able to do at connecting the dots was to say something like this, that churches collect revenue, they don't generate it. And therefore, somebody has to be out there generating revenue and giving to what he thought was the most important thing that God was doing in the world. And that was about all he ever connected the dots on, as much as we talked about it. But where this really came home to me was about 5 years or so ago when my youngest son was about to head off to college. He was leaving Southern California and going to the East Coast. And I was having a series of dinners with him to give him what I would call sort of dad's one last booster shot to nurture his faith seriously when he went to college. As we talked over particularly this last dinner that we had just a few days before he left for college, it became clear to me that nobody, even though he'd been involved in a terrific youth ministry and a great church in our area, nobody had ever connected for him his faith with the thing which he was most passionate about in his life, which was stage acting and theater. In fact, when I asked him how he was going to nurture his faith when he got to school, he didn't really have a good answer for how he would integrate that with what he was going to be spending the majority of his time at. By contrast, his very best friend was headed to a Christian college where he was studying to be a youth pastor. And I remember as we talked about the comparison between what the two of them were going to be doing, it dawned on me that my son actually thought that he was getting a bit of a pass on having to take his faith seriously simply by virtue of where he was going to get a paycheck vis-a-vis his best friend. That somehow, because his best friend was going to be a pastor, he was held to a higher standard of accountability for taking his faith seriously. And it was almost as though my son felt he was almost exempt from that, or it wasn't nearly as pressing. And that's when I realized how important it is that we get this connection between our faith and our work correct theologically. So let me suggest, I'm going to follow some slides here, that I'm going to make the argument that your work is definitely more than just a paycheck. And let me ask you a question just to get us thinking about this. If you were to take a poll of folks who are in the workplace, take a poll of people in this room who are in the workplace, how do you think they would understand their work in relation to their spiritual life? I asked that question of my seminary students, and there are very few questions with which I get more of a deer in the headlights look than that one. What that tells me is that my seminary students have not really thought about this much, which in turn tells me that the men and women they serve in their local church haven't thought about it at all. Which means that the vast majority of their life is going virtually untouched by their Christian faith. I take it a step further, and I get some really interesting answers to this question when I ask my students, how do you think in the church in which you serve, take it the church in which you attend, how are men and women who are in the workplace full-time perceived in their churches vis-a-vis pastors, missionaries, and those who are getting a paycheck from a church or other Christian organization? I get some really interesting answers to this. I had a woman who told me at one point in one of my classes, she said, my church looks at business people as pockets to be picked. I thought, yikes, we got serious work to do. Another student told me about a business person in their church, retired, who's very generous to the church, who they refer to as their distinguished ATM. Not much better, is it? My students also say that business folks and marketplace folks can be very helpful in terms of administering some of the business ends of the church. Pastors, I think, have a little bit different take on that because I think sometimes business folks and pastors don't recognize that churches and businesses are two sort of fundamentally different types of outfits, even though they have a lot of things in common. Some of my students say, well, the people who are in the workplace, they are around people who will likely never darken the doors of our churches, and it may be that that the people in the workplace are the only witness to the gospel that they ever get. In fact, I tell my students I get a big kick out of people who lament that they're the only Christian in their particular workplace, at which point I respond really quickly to say, you mean God's entrusted that in whole organization just to you? Hey? Hard to believe, but true. But then I get some even less encouraging answers. I have business people who tell me, workplace people who tell me that they're not on the front lines of what God's doing in the world. Which the first time I heard that, I thought, where did you get such a backward view of the church? Where did we get the idea that what happens inside this church building is actually the front lines of what God's doing in the world? And the church is an equipping station and a mass unit. And the front lines of what God's doing in the world begins when we leave the building, not when we come here. Yet I can't tell you how many of my seminary students think that the most important thing that God's doing in a person's life happens when they enter this building. Okay? Not that what goes on in here is unimportant, but that's a bit like a soldier who goes to boot camp and says, I think I'll stay here because this is where all the action is. I think, no, the action is out there when you leave the building. I get my seminary students who say things like, I left my business to serve the Lord full time. And now I don't even humor them. I used to humor them. Now I just say, where did you learn such terrible theology? I'm hoping, desperately hoping, it wasn't at our place that they did that. Or I left my business to go into vocational ministry, as though that's any better. I have a number of students who we would call bivocational pastors. I'm not real happy with that term, but I hadn't found a better one yet, but almost without exception. My students who are in bivocational pastorates view what they do in the workplace as a means to an end only. The only value it has is to pay the bills so that it frees them up to do what they think is really important for God's kingdom, which is what they do pastoring the church. And if their wives, if their spouse is supporting them to do that, the spouse's work is viewed in the same way, only as a means to an end. Now, some of you may have read the book Halftime. Not many of you look old enough for that book to have been relevant for you. If you're not familiar with it, it's written by a former cable TV executive who, after he'd sort of been there, done that in the workplace, his kids were grown and flown, he decided that he was going to reassess his own sense of gifts and calling and move what he called from success to significance, and in the second half of his life be about kingdom work. And I wanted to say to those, although I'm not sure that was his intention, but that's the way it's been understood, but I want to say, what did you think you were doing with the first half of your life? Why wasn't that viewed as significant? And I think what that reflects, I think, is what I would call a theology of work and vocation that's not so much incorrect as it is incomplete. And I want to fill out the rest of the story in the next few minutes before we close off and you go out to the rest of your weekend. Where this comes from, it seems to me, or where this begins, actually, is if I could summarize the big story of the Bible here really briefly in about 15 seconds. Okay? It goes creation, fall, redemption at the first coming of Christ, and then consummation of the kingdom when God's kingdom comes in its fullness with the return of Christ. In other words, it's the way things ought to be, the way things are, right? The way things could be, and the way things will be when the Lord returns. Now, I don't know about you, but I confess, I was theologically malformed. Because I got chapters 2 and 3 down really nicely. I've been to seminary with the best of them, and we got sin and redemption and the cross and the resurrection and depravity, all of that down really nicely. But nobody ever told me about the bookends of creation and consummation, and what those contribute to the big story of the Bible. Because if sin and redemption is all you have half the story. Because our salvation is not just for ourselves. Our salvation is actually for the life of the world. And God is in the business not just of redeeming human beings, but of redeeming the world. Because as Paul says in Romans 8, all of creation is groaning for its redemption, which suggests that all of creation will eventually be redeemed when Christ returns. Now, at the book ends, if you look really carefully, what you'll discover is that work plays a very prominent place in both of them. In fact, if I ask my seminary students, mostly will get this right. If I have a group of business people, sometimes the answers are mixed. But when did God ordain work? In Genesis 2 or Genesis 3? Which is it? How many say 2? Okay? How many say 3? There's only 2 choices, so you got to vote, okay? Okay. Some smart aleck one time corrected me and said God actually ordained work in Genesis 1, which is true. We get a fuller account in Genesis 2. Most people, I think, treat their work as though it were ordained in Genesis 3. They treat their work as their penalty, which strikes me as one of the reasons why most people I know are working as hard as they can to make as much money as fast as they can so that they can retire as soon as they can and do something else that they think has more value to God's kingdom. But in Genesis 1 and 2, God ordains work prior to the entrance of sin. In paradise, he calls Adam and Eve to work because work was intrinsically good. The fact that it's ordained in paradise as a part of human beings exercising dominion over all of creation. I mean, the way human beings exercised dominion was primarily through their work and procreation, because they couldn't do it all by themselves. But in Genesis 1, where it says to be fruitful, we often connect those two with be fruitful and multiply, referring to procreation. But those are 2 separate things. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it. And the be fruitful part has nothing to do with procreation. You know what it has everything to do with? Economics and vocation. What God is saying to Adam and Eve is to be vocationally fruitful. Be economically fruitful. Be productive in ways that bring honor to God. In fact, the word there for keeping the garden, which was referred to in the video, the word avodah actually means to serve or to keep, and is also is translated in some places as worship as well. All of that suggests that work is intrinsically good from paradise at the beginning. But in paradise at the end, it's the same thing. Now, I hate to break this to you, but when the Lord returns and brings his kingdom in its fullness, you will still be working. Okay, so I'm getting a really dirty look from some of you on this. But think about for example, one of the figures of speech that the prophets used to describe the kingdom in its fullness is they will beat their swords into what? Plowshares. And their spears into pruning hooks. The implements of war not only will be no more, but they'll be transformed into the implements of productive work. Which I think suggests that we will have, not only have work, we'll have an economy. We'll have exchange. We'll still have trade and a medium of exchange. It's just that the workplace will be free of sin and corruption. Okay, now, I confess, I have a little bit of a hard time wrapping my arms around what that's going to look like. But the idea is in both aspects, in both bookends of paradise, work plays a significant role and is viewed as intrinsically good. Now, obviously, work has instrumental value. It accomplishes a lot of things. But what the Bible teaches is that work also has intrinsic value. It's good in and of itself, regardless of what else it accomplishes. So work begins at creation. It's part of the dominion mandate. Work is also significant because it's a part of who God is. We work fundamentally because that's a significant part of who God is and what it means to be made in his image, which is the reason that Solomon can say things like this. in Ecclesiastes. These are some really striking statements that he says about our work. In Ecclesiastes 2:24, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own work. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? Ecclesiastes 3:12, I know there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their work. This is the gift of God. It's repeated in several other places in Ecclesiastes. The New Testament brings this out, I think, incredibly clearly. Colossians 3, beginning in verse 23, in whatever you do, which is admittedly, that's a pretty big tent, right? That covers a lot of ground. Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Now, parentheses here, in whatever you do, here's the punchline, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Now, notice, back up one more verse to verse 22 and look at who this is addressed to. Slaves, or household servants is probably a better term for this, obey your earthly masters in everything. Household servants, in whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Household servants, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Arguably, in the ancient world, the most mind-numbing, meaningless grunt work that you can imagine was dignified by the Apostle Paul and described as service to Christ. I love the way the late Chuck Colson put it. He said, we are hardwired for work. Part of our spiritual DNA. Now, to be fair, we're hardwired for Shabbat as well, because our work is not everything about who we are. The late British novelist Dorothy Sayers put it like this, that work is not what one does to live, but the thing one lives to do, the medium in which he or she offers himself or herself to God every time you go to work. Now, to make sure we get this right, let me take this a step further. I will often ask folks who are in the marketplace, I say, tell me about your ministry in the workplace. Okay? What kinds of things do you think they say in response? I pray for my coworkers. I look for an opportunity to talk about my faith. I show compassion on them. I'll go out of my way to serve my coworkers, for example, if I know they're going through a difficult time or their life's coming unraveled. If I have the opportunity to be involved in some sort of Bible study or small group at my work, I do that. You know what they almost never say? Usually at the end of that, I point out to them that all of those things that you are telling me are things that you are doing when you are not doing your job. They almost never include the actual work they do as part of their ministry. Now I started thinking, why is that? Why have we missed this really big piece of what matters about our work? And I think that the answer is that our vision for what our work can do, our view of the ministry of our work just simply is not big enough. Because the term, when the New Testament used the term for work, it's the same term as good works. Yet it's very rare that I hear anybody talk about your good works and connect it to the actual work that you do for a living. It's very rare that, as often as we hear people talk about loving your neighbor, I almost never hear that applied to the interactions that you have in the workplace. And I have only heard one time anybody ever make reference to how your spiritual gifts might actually be relevant to what you do with the majority of your waking hours. See, I think what we've missed is this intrinsic value of your work. Now we have banner. It's about the size of that screen that hangs down from the entrance to the business school where I teach at Biola University that says business as ministry. And there are a number of ways they could have said that. They could have said business and ministry, set them in opposition to each other, or ministry in business. But they focused on the work itself of business as ministry. I actually think we can wrap our arms around this idea a little bit easier if we use the main word that's translated, that we often translate ministry, the Greek term diakonia, is more often translated as service. And if we use the term service, business as service, I think we might have a little easier time getting our head around that idea, because ministry tends to have so much church baggage attached to it. But if we see our work fundamentally as service to our communities, to our neighbors, and ultimately service to Christ as we serve our neighbors, then I think we might have a little bit better handle on this. What I try to emphasize to my students comes from Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, I want you to see how the term ministries, the word diakonia here is used. This is in verse 1 and 2. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution, the NIV reads, but it's literally the daily diakonia, the daily ministry of food. Right? Now, these very dependent widows, if they weren't provided this sort of daily ministry of food, they were going to be in really tough shape. But here's in verse 2, so the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry, same word, of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Both of those things, the service to the widows and the service the apostles were doing, were both referred to as diakonia, as service. Both referred to as ministry. They're just simply different arenas of service. And that's what we mean when we use the term your vocation. Your vocation and your occupation are not the same thing. Right? In the Bible, your vocation is a particular arena of service to which you are being called. And all of us have multiple vocations that we are called to all at the same time. Right? Now, for myself, I have a vocation as a professor, but also as a husband, as a dad, as a neighbor, as a faculty member in my community, in my seminary community. I actually think we all have a vocation to a different part of the world. Most of those are temporary, but I think God calls us to those things too. And the idea is that the arena that God has called us to is simply that. It's just a different arena of service, so that nobody, when a pastor steps down, they're not leaving the ministry. They're changing arenas of service. Right? And it seems to me one of the ways that we can make, I think, a tangible difference in this is to ensure that our language reflects our theology in this. Okay, so let me suggest a handful of terms that I would suggest excising from your vocabulary. Right? I've encouraged my seminary students to stop talking about themselves as being in full-time ministry. Because I try to point out to them that when you say that about yourself, the average person in the workplace takes that as though they are in part-time or no-time ministry. Neither of which is true theologically. In fact, if we use the term service there, it's a little easier to get that because I think then we can say that all believers are in full-time service, and the point at which you enter that full-time service has nothing to do with where you get a paycheck from, right? You were in full-time service by virtue of coming to faith. And the only way you leave full-time service, dying doesn't do it. That's just a different arena of service. The only way you leave full-time service is to walk away from your faith. And so if I have somebody who tells me they are leaving the ministry, I look at them really wide-eyed and say, tell me you're not defecting from your faith. Because that's what that means if you are leaving full-time service. I mentioned this morning to those of you who were in the session on ethics, but I would encourage us to excise the term secular jobs from our vocabulary, because in God's economy, there's no such thing as a secular job, right? If by secular we mean a place where God is not, and if the earth is the Lord's and all therein, then there is no such thing as a secular job, right? And for the people who are wrestling with this question of how do I bring God to work, I say, really? That's the question you're asking? Because it never occurred to you that God's already there and well ahead of you? That, I think, is, that's sort of a profound grasp of the obvious. I've also encouraged my students to stop talking about higher callings as though there is some hierarchy of callings in God's economy. Let me just refresh your church history a bit. The Reformation literally drove a stake into the heart of that view. And Luther's statement that there is such a thing as a worldly calling that's just as dignified and just as noble as the calling to be in a monastery or the calling to be a pastor. Okay. Luther, in fact, was well known. He has some very colorful ways in which to say this. He was well known for saying, even the hangman brings honor to God if he does his work well. Okay, I admit that's a certain view of the death penalty I understand that we may not all share. Luther also said it's just as holy to change a baby's diaper as it is to read him a Sunday school lesson. I think he got the idea that God calls people to a variety of arenas of service. Okay? I've also encouraged my students to stop talking about one more. To sort of stop talking about the pastorate being the front lines of ministry, and to get their view of the church correct as being the place where we send people out and we patch up the wounded. Hopefully it's not the place where we shoot the wounded. We patch them up and send them out. Now, we've started a tradition where we commission workplace folks to their full-time ministry in the workplace. The church that I go to is in the habit of ending our service with the statement from the 90th Psalm, which you saw on that video. It said, Lord, establish the work of our hands. Yes, Lord, establish the work of our hands. That's the message that we get sent out with at the end of every worship service. So let me close with a story here of a friend of mine who I think got this right. He and his wife were coming back from a European vacation. And on the jetway, they'd just gotten off the plane. On the jetway leading back into the airport, his wife collapsed. Unconscious, still breathing, but unconscious. Rushed her to the emergency room. Rushed her to a neurosurgeon who, after an MRI was done, they found a small tumor about the size of a quarter at the base of her brain that had caused her blackout. And through new technology that was just available at that time, called the gamma knife, they excised the tumor in outpatient brain surgery, which I thought was an oxymoron, but turns out it not so much. And she went home that same day, and to my knowledge, she is just fine today. And I remember her husband, who's my good friend, was marveling at all of the occupations, all of the vocations that had to come together to facilitate her healing. And he was particularly taken with the imaging software that enabled the surgeon to pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to get it out, minimizing collateral damage to the rest of the brain. You know what he said? He said, I am so glad, assuming that person's a follower of Christ, I am so glad that the person who designed that imaging software didn't decide to leave their business to go serve the Lord full time. I think he got it right. And so for those of you who are pastors or church leaders, let me suggest that you change the language that we use to talk about our ministries, that we spend more time with the workplace folks in our congregations out in their particular place of work instead of them having to come see us on our turf. In fact, my good friend who's a pastor in Kansas City told me about the last pastoral visit he made to a hospital, not as a chaplain, not to visit a patient, but he said, my last hospital visit, I scrubbed in. A person in his church was a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he scrubbed in and stood at the operating theater right beside him, which would have wiped me out because my stomach's way too queasy for that. But the physician at the end said, I have never had anybody in church leadership who ever cared about my work as much as you have. And I think those of you that work in the marketplace, I don't know. It may be, I get the general sense that people who work in the marketplace don't consider their pastors to have a lot to say to them about how to navigate what they deal with in the workplace. And it starts, I think, by learning and listening to what our folks are doing in the marketplace. And given simply the number of hours that people work in the workplace, vis-a-vis the number of hours they spend in a church building, they probably spend by a factor of 10 more hours in the workplace. It stands to reason to me that the workplace is going to be the primary place where they are spiritually formed, where they have the opportunities to love their neighbor, if they had their antenna up to recognize those opportunities and to see them for what they are, which is God's chiseling hand to shape their character and their spirituality. So that's my sort of closing charge to you, is for those of you who are in the marketplace, when they do this conference again next year, you should require that part of the entrance fee is inviting 2 people on your pastoral staff to come with you. And for those of you who are involved in church leadership, yeah, the pastorate's crucial. It's a noble calling. But don't raise the nobility of the pastorate at the expense of what the vast majority of people are doing with the vast majority of their lives. Amen?